Hello, I'm Susie. Welcome to my podcast. This is part 3 in a series on general what-upness is happening in the world. With previous 2 episodes, I talked a little bit about the midterms and a little bit about the Supreme Court. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Supreme Court. And in specific, there's one case that's up of specific interest, and again, it's in North Carolina, but it relates as well to another case in Massachusetts. The North Carolina case is the Students for Fair Admission versus UNC, and the second is in Massachusetts, the Students for Fair Admission v. the President and Fellows of Harvard University. And both of those cases sort of refer back to a 2003 decision called Grutter v. Bollinger, and that case basically indicates that race can be used as a consideration when qualifying for admission. So both of these cases, and then the North Carolina case is the actual one that's on the shadow docket with the court right now, I believe. I'm not sure about the Harvard case. I think it too is sort of like in that zone, but so interestingly, the Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard case involves a case brought by AAPI individuals and other people of color, not Black, Latinx, or Native, but Asian Americans specifically. And it's confusing to me that a community of color would be a proponent of that. So I want to, kind of dive in a little bit to that, and further, it brought to mind sort of Asian Americans, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders, that group of people. I think Americans process their communities differently when thinking about them politically as compared to Black and brown people. And I was interested about that, and so I kind of did a little bit of sniffing around, and I found some really interesting information that I want to talk about in terms of the history of immigration, and how I think that that's sort of galvanized into kind of our cultural understandings of these groups. So that's what's coming up. I hope you'll hang out. It'll be interesting, really. I know maybe it doesn't sound like it, but if you trust me, come along for the ride. I'll make it interesting. You'll see. So, affirmative action is a curious zone. It's a curious area to me. Admittedly, I am a progressive. When I think, politically, I lean more towards progressive policies than I do anything else. So to me, given the history of racial tension and marginalization in the United States, like affirmative action seems like an obvious need to me. But I'd own that my lens is different from, a lot of other people. Not least because I am in a, moderately, I grew up in a pretty solid middle-class family. So I, came from a background of privilege, and my ability to get into college. First of all, I wasn't getting into Harvard. Let me just full disclosure there. I never had a prayer of getting into Harvard, but I had a broader, both economically and demographically, I had a broader set of choices before me because of my privileges. I think that's just objectively true. So to me, affirmative action seems like an obvious mechanism that's required. Affirmative action was enacted in 1961. So it was obviously in a period where there was a lot of legislative response to civil rights demonstrations and a lot of political pressure to be thinking about, Black voters as people and with all of the rights that are afforded to them under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, and that their, right to vote and their rights to all other equal treatment under the law is intact in the Constitution. Like, it's fairly straightforward. So here is a problem. If you oppose that affirmative action is a necessary measure in American society, then you are, in essence, denying that systemic racism is embedded in all aspects of society. The jury is in, folks. Racism underpins nearly every American institution that exists. That requires intentionality to our approach to diversity and inclusion. And I find it especially troubling that communities of color would seek to weaponize that to drive their own self-interest or at the expense of others. In a word, uncool. But what would be behind that, right? I mean, that's a pretty cynical proposition. And I don't necessarily accept that the folks that are at the core of this, are like, fuck Black people. There are Indian and, Indian American and Chinese American and other South Asian American families that are a part of this coalition. The coalition, the Students for Fair Admission, is a group formed and led by a fella named Ed Bloom, who is not a person of color. He is a conservative activist. He does have a history of fighting affirmative action for many, many years. So it's interesting to me that he has insinuated himself with, these AAPI groups and has sort of, I feel like, pushed some buttons there that strategically leverage some of the privilege that is afforded those groups within culture. Yeah, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it. I think that many white Americans think differently about Indian Americans and Southeast Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese, Korean, Laotian, etc., Vietnamese. Like, we have a tendency to think about those classes of people a little bit differently than we think about Black people or brown people, like Latinx people. And I think that there are a lot of reasons for that, which I'll come to. But the case itself, the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard, and the case against UNC, the complaint sort of centers around the idea that the Grutter v. Bollinger decision in 2003, which allows race to be a consideration in the process of reviewing qualifications for admission. Their claim is that that ruling is unconstitutional and represents that it disqualifies Asian Americans from being fairly considered, when compared to other groups. So, man, it's again, I feel like, intuitively, right, you can sort of understand that you feel like that there's an imbalance in the formula here right away, right? And you would be right, because it's interesting to note that demographically speaking, Asian admissions of Asian American students into Harvard floats around 20% higher than every other race, not including white, every other non-white race. So they already have like sort of a disproportionate number of admissions when compared to Black or Latinx people. So that, again, right there, that sort of like, how are you disadvantaged? Like, you're you're already a little disadvantaged in that you're not considered for the larger number of seats, really speaking, apparently, since you're still demographically not fully represented. But your representation in Harvard admissions is, compared to the representation of AAPI people in the American population in general, is a lot closer than the gap between Black and brown people, like other brown people, like Latinx people in particular. So that's confusing. It is. And P.S. If you want to know a little bit more about the SFA and this Harvard suit, Hassan Minaj did. He's a comedian who was on the Daily Show for a while, and he had a show on Netflix for a while called The Patriot Act. And the very first episode of that show is actually about affirmative action and about this case. And it's really great, actually. It's a really great show. He did a good job. And it's a lot of fun. So I would recommend watching it if this is something that you're interested in, or just in general, because that show is great. He did a good job, and it's very informative and a lot of fun. And it's very mixed media presentation. In any case, so again, I keep, first things first is to say that the court case itself, is troubling to me. Again, that we find ourselves in a situation of arguing that affirmative action is necessary because we still are in a culture that disadvantages communities of color in general, politically, educationally, economically. So until those things aren't, factually and demonstrably true, then I think affirmative action has to stay in effect because unconscious bias is a thing and it's unconscious. And so sometimes you have to have a conscious mechanism to offset the unconscious bias. Like it's not that difficult. And it, like other political mechanisms, is flawed in its application. So is there a reason to criticize how affirmative action is stated, how it is implemented, how it is enforced? Oh, yes, very definitely so. That should be a regular process, right? A regular pruning, a regular audit, a regular review of these things should be happening, right? Our understanding of them and our manifestation of legislation will evolve and change, and it should. Yay, that's a good thing. But to eliminate it entirely is a flawed and myopic concept based on racist principles, period. And that's one of those uncomfortable truths that a lot of white people don't want to confront. But sorry, it's just what it is, man. Just suck it up and aim higher, I guess. And I know that sounds like, tough love. Maybe you're getting a lot of that from me today. I don't mean to. I tire of, this incessant insistence that people's bad feelings about things should materially affect how legislative policies are enacted. That's so stupid. That's so dumb. And it's insulting to people who have actually had to fight to maintain those rights. Do you think any Black person in the world is I want equal rights because it hurt, because the other hurts my feelings? No, it's because they don't want to get hung from trees and shit. Think more broadly and remember that people that look like you who do bad shit aren't you. You don't have to take responsibility for other people's actions, but you do have to acknowledge that those things happened and that we can do better and that you'll commit to doing better. That's as much as anybody can do. And people will love you for it. That's what I think. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the idea of Asian Americans as sort of where they fit into the racial understanding of communities of color, through the lens of American whiteness. It feels landminey. As I'm saying these words, I feel like, oh no, I'm about to dive into something really complicated and dangerous, but I'm not. I'm going to reassure you that I'm not. I don't. Please don't prepare yourself to hear something shocking from me. This is history. Because what it made me think is why do I feel like white Americans tend to treat Asian Americans differently than Black Americans or Latin Americans or Native Americans. Like why do I feel like there is an elevated attribution to those classes? Or in some limited ways, to those classes, right? And so I was curious about it, and I did some digging into the history of it, and ooh, juicy goodness ensued. So that's coming up. I hope you'll hang out. These affirmative action cases really caught my eye and sort of, demanded my attention because it made me think about the ways in which some of these families are being manipulated to be sort of like poster children for what is ultimately like a white supremacist agenda by sort of propping up this like, preferred group of brown people. And I just was like, what? I'm super confused about this. Like I'm confused about the demographics. I'm confused about the conversation relating to racial justice and equality, in America, particularly because there, on the one hand, is this like kind of like preferential tone. And then on the other hand, there are instances of, AIPI hate, people, killing Asian people and with a special focus on like Southeast Asian people, in connection with the pandemic, in connection to Chinese laboratories, like all again, like a lot of like crazy conspiracy stuff. So it just really spun up some old racial hate and refreshed it in new 21st century terms. And so when this case came up, I was like, like this is curious because it's still a case about race, and yet it's a very different type of case focused in on the privileged classes of folks who are getting into Harvard, so but it connects back to that other stuff. And so one of the things that drew my attention, because it made me think about the, kind of quota systems. And the first thing you think about with respect to quota systems, or at least me, is immigration. And what I found was that the United States didn't have an immigration policy of really any kind until like closer to the middle of the 20th century. Like that, the 1900s, which I hate to say the 1900s because it sounds like the era in which I was born was like old timey. Perhaps it was, I don't know. But in any event, like it was a not a we didn't start out with a well-crafted immigration policy. And one of the first like major immigration legislations was a law passed in 1882, and it was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it did exactly what it said. It prohibited Chinese and really any other person of Asian origin from entering the United States. Now, this is essentially the first structural immigration policy that had ever been passed in the United States. And it was a mess. That was the basis for like our immigration policy. Really was this endeavor to shut the doors to Asians coming into the country at a point in time when the economy was rebounding after the Civil War and the demographics were changing in such a way that there was competition in the U.S. between Asians and white people, and the California was sort of the origin of this. And there's a fun quote about California that I heard that I love by the author Wallace Stegner. He was like a Western author, and he said once that California is like the rest of America, just more so, which I think is a fun and accurate quote. But the Chinese Exclusion Act was born out of an effort to prevent Asians from competing in the gold mines mainly in California, And it sort of rolled up into a much broader, not unlike the tensions between African Americans at the time, post Civil War, now that African Americans were no longer slaves, but then, and there was this period of time where Reconstruction really gave Africans a space in the economy. There was some ability for them to be sort of like building equity and also finding avenues into the halls of power through state legislatures and Congress. And the wheels kind of started to fall off the bus because there was competition economically amongst, poor whites. And because we are fundamentally a white supremacist country in our origins, that was, a big problem because they kind of looked around and were like, what do you mean these subhuman people are actually doing better than us? That's not right. And that's not fair. And that's not what America is about. Like, that is the fundamental position that was taken then. And that's ultimately taken now, that Black people are doing better. And that's not fair. Or, Asian Americans are doing better. And that's not fair. They have more advantages than the white people because there are legislative considerations that keep them from being discriminated against. So that's not fair. Oh, it's so dumb. It's real dumb, but it's very white people thinking. It's very like racist thinking that, it's very obvious that white people are worth more, better than, so if somebody else is doing better, it can't be because they just happen to be doing it better. It had to be because there's another, prop, there's a crutch, there's something that, gave them a leg up. Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Oi, pull your head out of your butt, friends. That's not a way to live, because again, it sort of starts at the fundamental conclusion that other people that don't look like you aren't actually human and are somehow of less value. And that's like obviously untrue. Like, there's no data on earth that would reinforce that finding, like, of any kind. It's like horribly refuted. And in fact, all of the data, it concludes that race is not a real thing. It's sort of a made up, I mean, we have different, skin tones and other like cosmetic distinctions due to different zones of the world where, humans evolved. The different like exposure to sun, like it kind of calibrates the melanin production in your skin, which is why, people who are from areas that like tropical areas, there's more melanin in their skin, sort of protect them from the UV rays of the sun. It's a natural evolutionary mechanism. Like that's really the only difference. So that obviously doesn't qualify them differently cognitively or physically in any, way, fundamentally. It's just like stupid. So I look, this is my problem in life. I think that I sometimes believe that things that seem obvious to me seem obvious to everyone else. I think a lot of people do that. I think that's part of the problem, right? You assume that other people think the way that you do about these things. And so you're surprised when there's, radical opposition to the things that you think are like, just obvious. Like that the earth is round. Like it's obviously round. There are pictures. People have seen it, like multiple people, corroborating evidence. Earth is round. Yet, that doesn't stop a whole bunch of people from claiming strongly that it is not. Such is the world that we live in. So, yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act, originating in that, gold rush era and resulting in the exclusion of Asian Americans into the United States in 1882. So again, in the period after the Civil War, as African American labor, became expensive because it was no longer free. Chinese were a good stand-in, and there were a lot of opportunities for Asian American, or rather Asian immigrants, rather to find labor because they were competing in a now and then like a growing like sparse labor market, and they were willing to work cheap, and that became an economic pressure of sorts as that demographic kind of grew also. And sort of like in parallel, The United States in its, sort of nascent years, were really trying to find a way to establish ourselves in international trade. And China was a really major trading nation, at that point. And for many centuries before, see Christopher Columbus trying to, find a shorter route to Asia. So the United States, as a fledgling nation, was looking for a pathway to trade with Asia, but we really didn't have, like, at that time, right, that we didn't have, like, we weren't an economic powerhouse, like we really didn't have anything to offer. And so, but there were a lot of goods that we wanted from China, like we wanted the silk, we wanted the tea, like we wanted the stuff, but there was just not much that we could offer back, right, as a trading partner. And so what the US started doing, and they weren't the only ones, but they were one of the main ones doing it at the time, because they were just trying to get into the market, was they were importing opium into China illegally. And again, they weren't the only ones doing this, but that was their pathway into that market. And it really destabilized the Chinese economy. And as a result, a lot of Chinese people emigrated to the US, and especially around the time of the gold rush. So once again, there was competition sort of between poor white Americans and then these other, these others. And that sort of snowballed into a political movement that culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed in 1882. And that legislation was a 10-year exclusion, and it also stipulated that any of the Chinese folks that were already in the US were not citizens. Even if they had been born in the US, they did not have the access to birthright citizenship, which was afforded under the 14th Amendment, which had been passed in 1868. So you get a sense of the Chinese Exclusion Act teetering on this, like, unconstitutional premise, right? Seems like it would fail, but oh no. Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed again and again and again. So, brief timeline on the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1882, the original act included exclusions on, there were no laborers allowed, no wives, no families, but it did allow merchants and students. And at that point, there were about 104,000 Chinese in the US already. After that act, there was significant increases in racial violence against Chinese people, not unlike the lynching of African Americans. And there were also, interestingly, repeated litigations on behalf of Chinese people on 14th Amendment grounds, right? So that is something that has been distinct in the Chinese American community, is they have been very effective at using the courts, as Asian Americans in general, but beginning with Chinese Americans. There were a number of cases where that individuals brought, and some of them were won, relevant in those sort of like specific areas, but it still didn't affect the act itself. It sort of affected more, it chipped away at the legislation a little bit. Not unlike the Voting Rights Act has been being chipped away for the last, many decades, right? Like little bits at a time, little bits at a time. In 1892 was renewed as the Geary Act, and at that point it required a certificate be issued if you're a Chinese person or an Asian American of any sort in the United States. And I don't think Indian people, like Indian Asian people, at that point were even like a factor in this, because they were colonized by the British at the time. So it wasn't like they were just able to like up and emigrate, right? Like they didn't really get that choice. They were more or less stuck where they were. But the Geary Act requiring that certificate and the photo ID is similar to like kind of legislation forcing voter IDs, right? Like it's just kind of like, again, like kind of an obvious like racial, like pressure point, like show me your papers. Sorry, that was crass. But it resulted in a massive boycott at the time, which was really interesting. That Chinese Americans were like boycotting, or rather, they weren't Chinese Americans, Chinese at the time, Chinese in America. Then were boycotting, and they did make some economic impact, but it wasn't a major. 1894, there was a direct challenge to the birthright citizenship. On birthright citizenship ground by a guy named Wong Kim Ark. And he actually won that case. But, again, chipping away. 1902, it was reenacted again. And then in 1904, it was extended indefinitely. I want to say that again. It was extended indefinitely. Like, we need to stop voting on whether or not we want Asians. We don't. Like, ugh, it's really gross. 1904, that's when that happened. In 1917, it was refreshed with Asiatic exclusion, and it really wove in some super fun language that was born from the eugenics movement, which I've spoken about before, and is straightforwardly icky. Just ew, ew, ew. And it really inspired Hitler. So great job. 1924, then we get a quota system, which is sort of like merit-based immigration, like kind of, and it's arbitrary, but it favors whiteness, obviously. So we're looking at, we're going to allow much more people from European nations than we are, Western European nations than we are from, Eastern European nations, and certainly from like Asian countries. And then in 1943, the Magnuson Act was passed, and that was the repeal of the Chinese exclusion laws, but the quota system remained in effect, and it was still like a stupidly like it was just a very, very small and like manageable number. So that's kind of the history, right, of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it sort of demonstrates to me, A, that immigration is fucking broken, and it is broken because it's never been thought through at all, ever. That it's racist and totally based on white supremacist arbitrary values. And it absolutely should be overhauled in like the most significant of ways. And I want to just say that I'd like to talk more broadly about immigration at a later point, not saying that we should just like open the borders and like let everybody in. I understand the limits of physics, that, that's not a possibility. But the way that we're doing it and have done it historically is not great in terms of civil rights issues, human rights issues, and I don't think reflects our best values. So that's my position on that, and I hope again to talk more broadly about immigration, in a future pod. But one of the reasons that I think that is relevant specifically to this thinking, again, to sort of loop it back, is that here again, the ideas of Asian Americans and their place in American culture is very dependent on these histories. And in these histories, all of these people are considered to be a subjugated class of some kind by many, many, many white voters in this country and white politicians who are running our country. And, I think that that's just a really important, like, factual quotient that to keep in mind when we're looking at these complex, kinds of issues that seem like culture warrior or social justice warrior, type of missions. They do seem that way because progressives and liberals often have panicky and angry approach because their oppression is an angering thing. It's it hurts to watch other people, hurt. And when you become aware of it, it's hard to look away and like ignore it. So I think a lot of people are like, you know, why don't you give a shit? And it makes them mad. So I think it's important to keep that in mind on both sides, that these things are, issues on one side or the other, and they're deeply important to people. Again, to come to their positions honestly, their pathways are full of experiences and exposures and, influences that they may not even be aware of, right? Again, unconscious bias is a thing, and you should be sensitive to that and not avoid it, but also don't be mad about it because, you have it too. Everyone has it. And so it's a good idea to call it out, but it's also a good idea to understand that it's not like a light switch that you could just flip off. It takes time and a process of recognition and acknowledgement. And that's a very difficult thing for people to do. And it takes time and it takes patience. And that's what I encourage people to hold in their hearts, is just patience. It's hard. Being a human being is so hard. Our lives are so small and short and they feel, so big and important, but it's a good idea, I think, to zoom out a little bit. And especially when you feel that pressure, to kind of pull yourself out of it a little bit and take a step back and sort of think about things in more like broad or categorical terms. And it can then become a little less, and not quite urgent, right? Because it doesn't necessarily affect the urgency, but it absolutely affects the feeling of like, panic or, urgency in the sense that like it's actually on fire and like going to explode any minute. Like there's urgency to the extent that real people's lives are affected, like on the regs when it comes to politics and legislation and political issues and even, yes, culture war issues and social justice warrior issues. And, these things affect people's lives on a daily basis. So I think it's important that we, try to be aware of them and try to have dialogue about them. But the, the limitations between dialogues are getting in the way, I think, of our ability to see one another as humans. And that's where shit breaks down. You stop thinking about other people as humans. You start thinking about them in more defining characteristic terms, then it's a lot easier not to want to listen to those people because you don't like give them credibility in your mind. So beware autocratic thinking. Beware. We're in a very weird zone. So that's all I have for you this time. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so grateful for those of you who are returning. Thank you so much. For those of you who are new, listening for the first time, thank you so much. And I hope you'll listen to some of the previous pods. And for everyone, if you have comments, thoughts, questions, I would be delighted to hear from anyone. And you can reach me via email at Susie Makes a Podcast, SUZI Makes a Podcast at gmail.com or at Susie Makes a Podcast on Instagram. Thank you so much. And until next time.